The novel was written by George Orwell and published in 1949. Part 1. The protagonist of the novel, Winston Smith, has returned to his apartment. Looking out the window, he sees his workplace, the Ministry of Truth. On its building, the party slogans are displayed. War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength. In London, there are also the Ministry of Peace, responsible for war affairs, the Ministry of Plenty, which deals with the economy, and the Ministry of Love, responsible for maintaining social order and punishing citizens. The state is ruled by Big Brother, a fact reinforced by omnipresent posters featuring his image. Winston decided to start a diary, a risky endeavor, as it carried the threat of the death penalty, or, at the very least, 25 years in a labor camp. He sat in a narrow alcove, positioned so that he could not be seen by the telescreen. This wall-mounted device, which ordinary party members could not turn off, was used to monitor citizens. It could only be slightly dimmed. Throughout the day, the telescreen poured out a constant stream of propaganda. Due to the unusual layout of the room, the device could not see into the alcove, providing Winston with a secluded spot to write. He began by writing the date, April 4th, 1984. He then recalled an event from the records department where he worked. One day, two people he did not know well visited his office, a dark-haired girl from the fiction department, and O'Brien, a high-ranking official of the inner party. Winston suspected the girl might be a secret agent of the thought police. Suddenly, it was time for the 2 minutes hate. This daily ritual began with the face of Emmanuel Goldstein appearing on the screen. Once a founding member of the party, Goldstein had become its greatest enemy after leading a counter-revolution and, according to the official version, had been sentenced to death. Upon seeing him on the screen, the spectators began to scream and hurl objects at the display. Winston, however, felt differently. He believed the true threat was the party and Big Brother, not Emmanuel Goldstein. Then, the face of Big Brother appeared on the screen, delivering heartening words followed by the party slogans. At that moment, Smith's and O'Brien's eyes met for a fraction of a second. Winston had the irresistible impression that his comrade shared his views on the political situation and also hated the party. When Winston shook himself out of his reverie, he saw the words, "Down with Big Brother," scribbled repeatedly in his diary. Such thoughts and writings were the gravest of offenses, known as thought crime. This was punished by a nighttime arrest, followed by vaporization, the total erasure of a person from history and memory. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. It turned on to be only a neighbor, Mrs. Parsons, who needed help fixing a clogged sink. Winston noticed that her children were being raised as fanatical party spies, which filled him with dread. Around 2 o'clock, Winston put away his diary and left a distinctive speck of white dust on the cover, so he could tell if someone had opened it in his absence. Then, he left the apartment. The next day at 7:15 a.m., like every other official, he was awakened by a deafening sound from the telescreen. During the daily physical jerks, the mandatory morning exercises led by an instructor on the screen, Smith reminisced about his childhood. That night, he had dreamed of his mother. His parents and younger sister had disappeared overnight about 30 years earlier, during one of the first political purges. He also thought about the war, as he could not remember a time when Oceania was not at war. He recalled the air raids on London from his childhood, but he did not know who they were fighting then, because the official version of history was constantly changing. He believed that the past was not reliable, because as soon as Oceania changed alliances, the party immediately engaged in the rectification of facts. He feared this, as it meant the absolute power of the party, which could erase any event from history and convince people it had never even taken place. Finally, he went to work at the Ministry of Truth and sat in his cubicle. There, he was responsible for rectifying press reports to suit the party's needs. That day, he removed a mention in the Times regarding a certain dignitary who had been vaporized. In his place, he created a fictional hero, Comrade Ogilvy, who supposedly died in battle. The Ministry of Truth interfered in this way, not only with articles, but also with books, recordings, films, and magazines. Original sources containing facts inconvenient for the party were dropped into the memory hole, furnaces where the troublesome past was burned away. Next, Winston went to the canteen, where he met Syme, an intelligent philologist working on the 11th edition of the Newspeak dictionary. Syme enthusiastically sought to limit vocabulary, believing that narrowing the language would make thought processes impossible, and therefore ultimately eliminate the very concept of thought crime. Smith concluded that Syme was too intelligent and expressed his views too openly, which meant he would likely be vaporized soon, as the party required unthinking followers. In the canteen, he also noticed the dark-haired girl whom he suspected of being a thought police agent. Upon returning home, Smith continued writing his diary. He recalled how, 3 years earlier, he had visited an old and repulsive prostitute in the Prole district. In Oceania, such an act theoretically carried a sentence of several years in a labor camp. However, the party turned a blind eye if it involved proles and was devoid of emotion. Romances between party members were punished far more severely. Citizens were raised to believe that sex was merely an act intended to produce new party members, stripped of any pleasure. Winston had once been married to Catherine, but their union fell apart because they had no children. Winston's wife was fanatically devoted to the ideology and considered physical intimacy a tedious duty to the party. In his further reflections, Smith concluded that only the proles could overthrow the party. The proles are the proletariat, the working-class layer constituting about 85% of Oceania's population. Unfortunately, they were unaware of their own strength, which prevented them from rebelling. The party repeated the slogan, "Proles and animals are free." Although they lived in poverty and lacked access to education or the privileges of party members, they enjoyed relative moral freedom. They were not as strictly monitored by telescreens as the officials, because the party considered them too primitive to pose a political threat. Next, Smith began browsing a history textbook, pondering what life was like for people before the Revolution. He recalled the case of Jones, Aronson, and Rutherford, 3 original party leaders who were arrested around 1965. They were accused of treason and espionage. After confessing to their crimes in court, they were pardoned and reinstated to nominal positions. However, after some time, they were arrested again and executed. Smith, however, possessed proof of their innocence. A few years earlier, he had accidentally come across a 10-year-old clipping from the Times. A photograph in the newspaper showed all 3 at an official banquet in New York at the exact time they had, according to their later testimonies, supposedly been on enemy soil in Eurasia. Winston destroyed the clipping in a memory hole, but the mere fact of having held proof of the party's lies continued to haunt him. A few weeks later, while walking, Winston found himself in a derelict prole district. He noticed an old man entering a pub and followed him, hoping to hear an account of life before the Revolution. However, the old man remembered only insignificant details and complained about the lack of old beer measurements, which confirmed Winston's belief that history had been irretrievably lost. He then went to the antique shop where he had previously bought his diary. The very act of owning such items was risky, as it suggested a tendency toward individualism, known as own life in Newspeak. The shop owner, Mr. Charrington, showed Winston a room upstairs that had no telescreen. Winston liked the room very much, but for the time being, he held off on renting it. As he left the shop, He noticed the dark-haired girl from the fiction department again. He was now certain she was tailing him and that his death was imminent. Part 2. In the morning, in the corridor at work, Smith encountered the dark-haired girl again. Her arm was in a sling. As she passed Winston, she stumbled and fell to the floor. While helping her up, he felt her quickly press a small, folded note into his hand. He was deathly afraid and curious at the same time, but under the constant surveillance of the telescreens, he could not take it out. He hid it in a pile of documents on his desk. When a safe opportunity to read the message finally arrived, he saw written in large letters, "I love you." He was completely shaken and excited. He never expected that in a world of such rigid control, a feeling could emerge in this way. However, he was swept up in his duties, and only in the evening, after work, could he calmly analyze the situation. He knew he had to be extremely cautious. He decided to contact her without raising suspicion, and the crowded canteen seemed the best place for it. Only after a week of tense attempts did he manage to sit next to her and exchange a few whispered sentences. They arranged to meet in the crowd at Victory Square in London, where, under the cover of a passing convoy of prisoners, they finalized the details of their date. The mysterious girl's name was Julia, and she was 26 years old. Their first real tryst took place in a forest outside the city, at a spot she had previously scouted. She chose it because they could feel relatively safe there, away from hidden microphones and informers. Julia confessed that she hated the party as much as Winston did, but she had perfectly mastered the art of appearing to be an exemplary citizen. In reality, she rebelled by leading an active private life, which in Oceania was a political act. It was there, in a clearing, that they first made love, an act Winston perceived as a blow to the very foundations of the party's system. As time passed, the lovers saw each other rarely, as they were consumed by work and numerous party duties. To ward off any suspicion, Julia was an active member of the Junior Anti-Sex League, often wearing its symbol, a scarlet sash, around her hips. Her hatred for the party was pragmatic rather than political. Julia was not interested in ideology, but rebelled against the system because it forbade her from enjoying life and satisfying her own desires. To facilitate their secret meetings, Winston finally rented the small room above Mr. Charrington's shop. This place became a semblance of normalcy for them, a home where they could talk and rest away from the omnipresent telescreens. Meanwhile, Smith's suspicions were confirmed. Syme, the intelligent philologist, suddenly vanished, and his name was erased from the employee lists, meaning he had been vaporized. Hate Week was approaching. Hysteria gripped London. The city was plastered with posters depicting a giant, terrifying Eurasian soldier. A hate song was composed and broadcast incessantly by the telescreens. The atmosphere of fear was intensified by frequent rocket attacks on prole districts. Bombs fell on cinemas and playgrounds, resulting in dozens of casualties, including children. During the preparations for the rallies, effigies of Goldstein were passionately destroyed and burned. During their trysts in the small room, Winston and Julia talked about the Brotherhood, a legendary underground organization fighting the party. Both dreamed of taking part in a real revolution, though Julia was more skeptical than Winston. Smith, however, was convinced that O'Brien was a high-ranking member of the Brotherhood. Soon, an opportunity to establish contact arose. O'Brien, under the pretext of discussing a new edition of the Newspeak dictionary, invited Winston to his apartment, giving him his address right in front of a telescreen. Smith and Julia went to O'Brien's for their scheduled meeting. As a member of the inner party, he lived in a luxurious apartment filled with the aroma of good tobacco and food, things unattainable for ordinary citizens. During the meeting, O'Brien performed a gesture that left his guests stunned. He turned off the telescreen. He explained that high-ranking officials have this privilege for half an hour a day. Winston and Julia, trusting him implicitly, confessed that they were enemies of the party and wished to join the Brotherhood. O'Brien, maintaining a cold calm, questioned them about what they were prepared to do, whether they would be willing to kill, spread diseases, or harm innocent children, then began describing the organization's principles. He revealed that the Brotherhood is not a cohesive group. Its members operate in isolation and know only a few people so that, in the event of torture, they cannot betray the entire movement. As the meeting drew to a close, O'Brien promised to deliver to Winston the book by Emmanuel Goldstein, which contained the ideological foundations of the rebellion. A few days later, amidst the chaos of Hate Week, Winston received the aforementioned book. Together with Julia, during a tryst in their hideout above the shop, they began to study its contents diligently. The reading reinforced their belief that the only hope for changing the world lay in the vast mass of unconscious proles. Looking through the window at a working-class woman below, Winston said quietly, "We are the dead." Julia repeated the same words, and to their horror, the same iron voice echoed from inside the room. It turned out that behind the old engraving of St. Clement's Church, which Winston had trusted so much, a telescreen was hidden. Moments later, thought police officers burst into the room, beating the lovers and destroying their sanctuary. Mr. Charrington also entered the room. However, he no longer resembled a kindly old man. He stood tall, radiating coldness, and his facial features had turned hard. He turned out to be a high-ranking thought police agent who had been monitoring Winston's every step from the very beginning. He did not know where he was. He was likely in the Ministry of Love, but he had no way of being certain. His cell was windowless, lined with white tiles, and flooded around the clock by a blinding cold light. This was the place O'Brien had mentioned to Winston in his dreams, the place where there is no darkness, because the lights are never turned off. Winston was agonizingly hungry, as he had received nothing to eat since his arrest. He felt a growing, paralyzing fear as he observed that political prisoners, party members, were treated far worse and more brutally than ordinary criminals. In the cell, he overheard terrifying stories about labor camps and the mysterious Room 101, the very name of which sparked unimaginable panic among the prisoners. In this state of extreme exhaustion, Winston hardly thought of Julia. His mind was filled only with pain and the dread of the upcoming torture. In the cell, Winston also met other prisoners. One of them was the poet Ampleforth, who had been imprisoned because he left the word God in a new edition of Kipling's works. He explained resignedly to Winston that he simply couldn't find any other rhyme for the word rod. Shortly after, his neighbor Tom Parsons was also brought to the cell. It turned out that he had been denounced by his own young daughter, who had heard him screaming, "Down with Big Brother," in his sleep. Despite his arrest, Parsons was proud of his child's vigilance and believed that the party was right to punish him. After some time, Winston was alone in his cell again. He heard footsteps and saw O'Brien at the door. Winston, thinking he was being rescued, cried out, "They've got you too," to which O'Brien coolly replied, "They got me long ago." It turned out that O'Brien was a loyal party official, and his role in the Brotherhood had been merely a mystification designed to flush out thought criminals. A guard struck Winston's elbow with a truncheon, marking the beginning of the brutal interrogation phase. Smith was beaten and tortured for weeks. He was driven to such agony that he confessed to everything, from espionage to murders he had never committed. Next, Winston fell directly into the hands of O'Brien, who subjected him to torture using a device resembling an electric shock machine. O'Brien explained that the party is not interested in merely killing a heretic, but in his total transformation, so that before his death, he truly loves the system. The process of breaking his psyche began. O'Brien forced Winston to believe that 2 + 2 = 5, if the party said so. He also told him that Julia had betrayed him immediately after their arrest. Subjected to brainwashing, Winston began to change, learning doublethink and the acceptance of contradictory facts. He was told that the party's world is based on pure power and hatred, and that the individual has no significance outside of serving the ideology. After many weeks of working to change Smith, when he seemed to be obedient, O'Brien asked him about his true feelings toward Big Brother. In a fit of honesty, Winston replied that he hated him. As punishment, he was sent to room 101, a place where every prisoner faces what they dread most in the world. In Winston's case, it was rats. O'Brien prepared a special cage with starving rodents, which he intended to strap to the prisoner's face. At the last moment, seized by animalistic terror, Winston screamed, "Do it to Julia, not me!" This was the moment of his ultimate moral collapse. Winston betrayed the last person he loved and stripped himself of his humanity. After this event, he was released, though he was now only a shadow of his former self. Once, he accidentally met Julia in a park. They both confessed to having betrayed each other, but they were completely indifferent to one another. Their bond had been permanently destroyed by the Ministry of Love. Winston now spent his days at the Chestnut Tree Cafe, drinking cheap Victory gin, which allowed him to numb his mind. One afternoon, hearing from the telescreen about a supposed great victory for Oceania's forces in Africa, he felt a sudden euphoria. He looked with adoration at the giant poster of Big Brother and felt that his struggle against himself was over. Winston Smith finally loved Big Brother.